The night was black and still, the kind of silence that makes a man wonder if the world has stopped breathing. The prairie lay hushed under a veil of silver moonlight, grass swaying in slow waves like an ocean of whispers. Not a coyote dared to yip, not a wolf howled in the timberline. The wind had died, and with it, all sound. It was the kind of quiet Elias Kane had grown used to solitude, so deep it pressed against his ribs like a weight. But then came the knock. 1, 2, 3. Each strike against the weather-worn wood of his cabin door rattled the iron hinges. Echoing like cannon fire in the silence, Elias froze. His hand, steady as stone a heartbeat ago, halted mid-stroke above the blade he had been sharpening by firelight. The long knife gleamed orange in the glow, half-finished, but his warrior's instincts pushed aside such tasks instantly. He knew. This land knew its dangers, and knew with a certainty as cold as steel that no visitor at this hour brought peace. The fire crackled. Sparks leapt upward. His eyes narrowed toward the door. Nobody came to his door. Nobody. Not unless they were desperate or bringing trouble. Elias stood slowly, every motion calculated, silent. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with scars latticing the tanned skin of his forearms. His hair, long and black, brushed his collar as he turned, and his jaw clenched with the weight of old memory. He had lived alone in this cabin for 7 years, ever since he had left behind both tribe and town, both worlds that had rejected him. People called him half-blood, cursed him as savage or traitor depending on which side they stood, and in the end he had chosen neither. Solitude was safer. Solitude did not betray. Another knock came harder this time. He reached for the Winchester, rifle mounted on the wall, his other hand brushing across the revolver on the table, but he did not lift it yet. Instead, he crossed the creaking floor, each bootstep echoing in the stillness. The smell of pine logs burning in the hearth mingled with the faint metallic tang of oiled steel. His breath was steady, but beneath it ran a current of unease, a drumbeat from his warrior's blood that told him danger stood waiting. He unbarred the door, and there she was, a woman, near 30, stood on the threshold like a ghost spat out by the wilderness. Her face was streaked with dirt and the shadows of exhaustion, her lips trembling as if she had been running for days. Her clothes, once a faded calico dress, were torn at the hem, frayed by thorns, smeared with mud. In the moonlight, her figure looked fragile, but there was a steel thread in the way she stood, chin lifted despite the shaking of her hands. Her voice, when it came, was raw, low, desperate. "I can cook, clean, and be quiet. Please, just let me stay." The words cut through Elias like a blade. He studied her in silence, the old warrior's way eyes flicking over details, measuring truth against lies. Behind her, the prairie stretched into darkness. No wagon, no lantern light, no horse. But on the horizon, just barely visible in the silver wash of moonlight, a dust cloud lingered. Riders had passed not long ago. They had left her here, abandoned or worse, thrown her like unwanted cargo at his door. Elias felt his jaw tighten. He did not ask questions yet. Questions could wait. A woman does not come to a man's door at midnight, alone, filthy, and trembling. Unless desperation has driven her past pride. Her eyes flicked past him, quick and sharp, taking in the cabin with a glance. The single chair by the fire, the pot half filled with beans, the rifle over the hearth. She did not beg for kindness. She was bargaining, laying out her worth like coin on a gambler's table. "I can cook, clean, and be quiet," she repeated, though her voice cracked this time, as if silence itself was a wound she had been forced to carry. Elias said nothing. He studied her a moment longer, the firelight behind him casting his frame in shadow. His instincts warred within. Send her away and preserve his peace, or step aside and invite the storm. For he knew storms always followed strangers. The prairie wind rose, whispering through the chinks in the cabin walls. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote broke the silence, its mournful cry floating across the land. Finally, Elias stepped back from the door. His voice was gravel, deep and reluctant. One night. The woman's shoulders slumped with relief, but her chin stayed high as she crossed the threshold. She moved not like a beggar, but like a survivor clinging to dignity. The fire's warmth caught her face, and for the first time Elias saw more than the dirt. The exhaustion pooled under her eyes, the faint bruising at her throat, the hollow hunger in her cheeks. She pressed her hands toward the fire, shaking slightly, and Elias realized. This woman carried ghosts of her own. The kind that followed, the kind that knocked in the night. He shut the door, bars sliding back into place with a solid thunk. Elias Kane, who had chosen solitude as armor, who had kept his life stripped bare of ties, stood staring at the stranger, now seated at his fire. And he knew, in that moment, the night had changed everything. Elias Kane did not move right away. He stood in the doorway, the moonlight behind her painting her in silver, the firelight behind him throwing his broad shadow across the floorboards. His instinct screamed that she was trouble. Everything about the moment felt wrong. Strangers did not come this far out on the prairie unless desperation or death had driven them. Her breath puffed in white clouds in the chill night. Her lips parted as if to speak again, but no sound came. She simply looked at him, waiting. There was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and defiance, as though she knew she had already been judged too many times in her life, and this was just another trial to endure. Behind her, the prairie stretched endlessly under the pale moon. The grass shimmered like blades of glass, bending under a breeze that had risen suddenly, carrying with it the faint scent of horses. Elias's gaze sharpened. He knew the land too well to mistake the signs. She had not stumbled here alone. They? Faint dust clouds still lingered in the distance, settling into the horizon like the remnants of a storm. Whoever had left her here might not be far. His jaw tightened. Finally, he stepped aside. "One night," he said. Gravel rough in his throat, the woman let out a shuddering breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. She crossed the threshold quickly, as though afraid he might change his mind. She didn't cower or shrink as some might. Instead, she moved with an awkward dignity, clutching the torn folds of her dress, keeping her chin lifted despite the dirt and bruises that marred her skin. Inside, the warmth of the fire licked across her cheeks, painting her in soft amber. She stumbled toward the hearth, extending her hands to the flames, and Elias noticed how violently they trembled. Her fingers were raw, the knuckles scraped, as though she had fallen more than once before finding his door. She glanced around the cabin in silence. It was bare, practical, one table, one chair, a single bed against the far wall, a rifle mounted above the hearth, a few pots and pans stacked neatly by the shelves. Not a home made for company, but for survival. You live alone, she murmured, voice rasped and low. Elias grunted, neither confirming nor denying. He kept to the shadows, his back against the wall, studying her. The firelight carved the planes of his face, glinting off the bone pendant that hung against his bare chest, the copper bands tight around his arms. His body bore scars, some thin, white lines, others deep and jagged. They told stories she did not ask about and he did not offer. Her silence weighed heavy. She had said her piece outside. I can cook, clean, and be quiet. Now she sat, wrapped in her own exhaustion, as though waiting for judgment to fall again. But Elias's ears were sharper than most men's. He heard the little things, the catch of her breath whenever the fire popped, the quick dart of her eyes toward the window when the wind moaned. the way she pressed her back to the log wall as if bracing against blows that no longer came. She had learned silence as a shield, but silence could not hide fear from him. When the dawn began to edge against the horizon, Elias rose and pulled on his boots. He did not speak as he strapped on his revolver belt and shrugged into his coat. He was going to ride out for supplies. This was the agreement, one night only. He would return, and she would be gone. But before he reached the door, her voice cracked through the quiet. "They'll come back." He turned. She had not moved from her spot near the fire, but her eyes were fixed on him, clear and certain despite the dark hollows beneath them. Elias studied her in silence. "Men like that," she continued, her voice steadier now, "they always come back. They think they own what they've cast away. And if they can't have it, they'll make sure no one else does." Her words sat heavy in the cabin. He had heard such things before from men who raided villages, from soldiers who claimed lands, from ranchers who beat their wives and called it justice. The mark on her throat made sense now, the faint bluish bruise shaped like a hand. Someone had tried to silence her. Someone had claimed her as property. Elias's chest tightened, old fire stirring in his blood. He had promised himself long ago. He was done with other people's wars, that he would not draw steel or spill blood for anyone again. But there are some battles a man cannot walk away from. Not when the truth stares at him from across his own fire. The woman did not plead. She did not weep. She simply held his gaze as if daring him to ignore her warning. And Elias, the half-blood warrior who had buried his past, felt the old weight of choice settle heavy on his shoulders. This was no longer about one night. The cabin was never truly quiet, not to Elias. Years of warrior training had tuned his senses so sharply that silence only made the smallest sounds louder. He could hear the pop and hiss of the fire, the soft groan of the wooden beams when the wind pressed against the walls, and the faint shift of a woman trying to sit too still. She hadn't spoken since her warning the night before. True to her word, she was quiet. But Elias could hear everything she tried to hide, the way her breath caught whenever a branch snapped outside, the quickening of her pulse when a gust rattled the shutters, the faint scrape of her nails against her skirt as she clenched her fists. Silence had been demanded of her in another life, he realized. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of survival. When dawn spread pale gold across the horizon, Elias was already awake, seated by the window with his rifle propped against the wall. He had watched the prairie breathe back to life, the hawks circling above the sagebrush, the wild horses in the distance, the dust devils spiraling like dancers in the open fields. The woman stirred under the blanket he had tossed to her the night before. She blinked, and for a moment, confusion shadowed her face. Then memory returned, and her gaze darted first to the door, then to him. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias did not reply. Instead, he stood, tugging his boots tighter, fastening his revolver belt at his hip. He meant to ride into town for flour and salt, maybe a coil of rope. He had decided during the long night that when he returned, she would be gone. His cabin was no place for another's troubles, and the men who had left her here were bound to return. He had seen enough war to know that when trouble came hunting, it never left the ground unscarred. But before he reached the door, her voice broke the quiet again. "They'll come back." Elias stopped, his hand hovering over the latch. Slowly, he turned to face her. She sat up straighter, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, but there was no plea in her eyes. "Only certainty. Men like that," she said, her tone steadier. "Now, they don't stop. They'll come back because they think they own me. If they can't drag me back, they'll make sure no one else takes me in. They'll kill me." Elias's jaw hardened. He crossed the room with slow, heavy steps, kneeling by the fire as if only to stir it, but his eyes never left hers. The light from the flames caught the hollow bruising along her throat, the faint handprint pressed into her skin like a brand. Rage stirred inside him, quiet and controlled, but burning hot all the same. "What's your name?" His voice was low, rough from disuse. "Clara," she answered. The fire popped. He nodded once as if tucking the name away. Clara drew in a breath, then spoke again, her words spilling faster, as though a dam had cracked. "I was married off at 18. Promised to a rancher twice my age because my father said it would keep food on the table. I bore him no children. That made me useless." Her lips curled bitterly, though her eyes glistened. "He said a wife who couldn't give him sons was no wife at all. So he sent his men to discard me like spoiled goods. That's what you saw on the horizon last night, the dust of their horses. They threw me at your door like trash." Her voice broke then, but only for a moment. She swallowed hard, sat straighter, and continued. "But I'm not trash. I can cook, clean, work harder than most men. I can stay quiet if that's what keeps me alive. I'm worth more than what he said I was." Elias stared at her, the fires glow dancing in his dark eyes. He said nothing, but his silence was not judgment. It was a wait, a listening. Clara seemed to feel it, because her shoulders eased, as though for the first time in years someone had not dismissed her words. Wind shifted outside. A hawk's cry cut through the air, sharp and sudden. Clara flinched. Elias noticed. He noticed everything. And in that moment, as the morning sun crept higher and the shadows stretched long across the prairie, Elias knew two things with certainty. First, that the men who had cast her away would indeed return. Second, that when they did, they would not find the same man they thought had chosen silence and solitude. They would find the warrior they had forgotten still lived here. He straightened, his muscles tense as a bowstring. Clara watched him with wide eyes, but he gave no explanation. He only reached for the rifle by the wall, the weapon an extension of his arm, and checked the chamber with a slow, deliberate click. The sound echoed in the cabin, final and foreboding. The silence between them no longer felt like fear. It felt like the breath before a storm. The wind screamed that night, clawing at the cabin walls, whistling through the gaps in the wood like voices of the dead. Elias sat by the fire, his rifle resting against the chair, the glow of the flames painting his scarred chest and shifting. Bronze. Clara sat opposite him, her knees drawn up beneath the blanket, the flickering light softening the hard edges of her face. For a long while, neither spoke. It was Clara who broke the silence. Her voice was low, as though speaking too loudly might bring ghosts pounding at the door. "My name is Clara Monroe," she said. "I suppose I should have told you sooner." Elias gave no reply, only a curt nod. He was a man of few words, but his gaze never wavered from hers. She took in a breath that trembled, then pressed on. "When I was 18, my father promised me to a rancher, Malcolm Everett. A man twice my age, rich in land and cattle, poor in everything else that makes a man. I was told I should be grateful. He gave my family 3 horses for me." She laughed, bitter and short. 3 horses, that's what I was worth. The fire popped, spitting a spark into the air. Elias's eyes flicked toward the flames, but his face remained still. "At first, I thought I could bear it," Clara continued, her hands gripping the edges of the blanket. "I cooked, I cleaned. I tried to give him children, but none came. Each year that passed without a son made me less than nothing in his eyes. A barren wife is no wife, he told me. By the time I was 30, I was less useful to him than the horses he traded me for. And when he tired of me, he didn't even waste the effort of sending me away himself. He told his men to get rid of me." Her voice caught, but she forced herself to finish. "So they rode me out into the night, and when I begged them not to leave me in the open, they dragged me here, left me on your doorstep like a broken thing. She fell silent, her chest rising and falling as though she had run a long distance. Her eyes found Elias's across the fire. She braced herself for pity, or worse, contempt. That's what she had seen in the faces of others before, but Elias only sat in silence, the firelight reflected in his dark eyes. For a long moment, Clara thought he might say nothing at all. Then, finally, his voice rumbled low, deep, like stones grinding together. "You are not broken." The words startled her, as if he had reached across the fire and struck her. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Elias leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, gaze fixed on the flames. Men like that take and take, until there is nothing left but ashes. They think because they've crushed something under their boots, it has no worth. But ashes can still burn. I know. Clara's brow furrowed. She wanted to ask, but Elias's expression had shifted into the faraway look of a man dragged back into memory. He remembered fire. He remembered the acrid sting of smoke clawing his lungs, the orange glow devouring the lodges of his mother's people. He remembered the screams, the thunder of hooves, the sharp report of rifles. The U.S. cavalry had come with promises of peace and left with blood. His mother's voice, once the song of his childhood, had been swallowed in that smoke forever. He had survived because he was half-blood too Indian to belong among whites, too mixed to hold a true place among his tribe. To the soldiers, he was worth nothing, not even the bullet it would have taken to kill him. They left him standing in the ashes of his people, alone. Elias blinked, the firelight snapping him back into the present. His jaw tightened. His scars burned. Clara watched him carefully. She said nothing, but her eyes, tired, bruised, yet unbroken, seemed to understand more than words could reach. They sat in silence again, but it was not the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people bound by loss, by being discarded, by being told they were worth nothing. Yet here they were, breathing still, their very existence a defiance. The wind battered the cabin, rattling the shutters like fists. Outside, the prairie moaned beneath the storm. Inside, the fire crackled, stubborn against the dark. Clara drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her voice was softer now, but steady. "You think they'll come back for me, don't you?" Elias's eyes met hers, steady as stone. "Men like that always come back." Clara's lips pressed together, her jaw stiff. For the first time in years, anger lit her face brighter than fear. She nodded once, sharply, as if preparing herself for the truth of it. The fire between them snapped, sparks leaping upward. Neither flinched. In that moment, the cabin ceased to be a place of exile. It became something else, an ember refusing to die, a place where two discarded souls sat across from one another, each realizing that perhaps ashes could indeed burn again. The night was quiet, too quiet. No coyotes yipped in the distance, no owls stirred in the cottonwoods. Only the restless prairie wind whispered against the grass, carrying a stillness that pressed heavy on the senses. Elena felt it first, a prickle. At the back of her neck, a cold twist in her gut. She shifted uneasily where she sat by the fire, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The flames flickered low, shadows dancing across the cabin walls. She looked up at Kalen, her silent protector, and saw the same awareness etched into his hardened face. His eyes, dark as obsidian, scanned the horizon through the cabin window. Without a word, he rose. The warrior's body moved like coiled steel, every scar along his chest taut with tension. He stepped outside into the dark, his long black hair whipping against his back in the wind. Elena followed a few paces, fear pressing. Her chest. That's when she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the tree line beyond the prairie. Lanterns swayed, rifles glinted in the half-light. The men from town. Sheriff Cliburn at their front, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, his face cruel and certain. "Kaelin," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. The warrior lifted a hand steady, commanding silence. His body radiated calm power, though his eyes never left the line of riders approaching. Shirtless in the cool night, tribal jewelry catching the dim glow, he looked like some spirit risen from the earth itself, carved from fire and stone. "They came for me," Elena breathed, guilt rising in her throat. "I brought them to your door." Kaelin turned then, his gaze locking with hers. For a fleeting moment, she saw more than stone in his eyes, something deeper, a flicker of protectiveness that went beyond duty. "They will not touch you," he said, his voice low, steady. As thunder rolling across the plains, the pounding of hooves drew closer. Torches cut the dark. Elena could see their faces now, the sneers of men who had once been her neighbors, their eyes gleaming with malice. They wanted to drag her back, to punish her for leaving, for daring to stand against the cruelty she'd suffered. Kaelin stepped forward, planting himself between her and the mob. He reached for his rifle, but he didn't raise it yet. Instead, he called out, his voice carrying across the prairie like a war cry held in check. "This is not your land. You bring your hate where it is not welcome." Cliburn spat into the dirt, raising his lantern higher. "That woman belongs to us. Step aside, savage, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing." A hush fell. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elena's heart pounded so loud she thought the men could hear it. But Kaelin did not move. He stood tall, the bare chest gleaming. With firelight, scars of battles past painted across his skin like a map of survival. His long hair streamed loose in the wind, his jewelry clinking softly, a quiet reminder of who he was, of what blood ran through his veins. "You'll take her," he said at last, his voice iron, "over my body." The words sent a chill racing down Elena's spine. She knew what was coming. She wanted to scream, to beg him not to fight, but her voice failed her. The truth was written across the night sky. This would not end in peace. The sheriff's men shifted uneasily. Some laughed, a hard, nervous sound. Others gripped their rifles tighter, eyes darting between their leader and the warrior who refused to bend. Then Cliburn snarled, "So be it." The first shot cracked through the air, splitting the night. Elena flinched, a cry torn from her throat. Kaelin moved faster than her eyes could follow, raising his rifle in one swift motion, firing back with deadly precision. A man fell from his horse, torch tumbling into the grass. The prairie lit with sudden flame. Chaos erupted. Horses reared. Gunfire thundered. Shouts split the dark. Smoke and fire blurred the line between earth and sky. Through it all, Kaelin stood like a storm-given flesh, his body moving with the fluid grace of a predator. He fired, ducked, and rose again, his hair wild, muscles taut, jewelry flashing in. The inferno. Every shot he loosed was a warning, a promise. None would pass him while breath still filled his chest. Elena pressed herself against the cabin wall, heart hammering, tears burning her eyes. She wanted to run to him, to shield him, but she knew she'd only get in the way. All she could do was watch as the warrior battled for her life, and in that firelit chaos, as bullets screamed and the prairie burned, one truth seared itself into her soul. Kaelin was not just fighting the men of the town. He was fighting fate itself. The world seemed to stop breathing. Dust whirled lazily in the air, the sound of boots shifting on wooden planks echoed faintly, and every eye in the town was fixed on the wide street where Kael and the strangers faced each other. Ruth could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, so loud it drowned out every other sound. She wanted to run, to hide, but her legs refused to move. Beside her, Kael stood tall, silent, his bronze skin gleaming under the punishing sun. He looked unshakable, carved from stone, and yet every line of his body radiated coiled strength. Like a bowstring drawn to its limit, one of the gunmen, a squat man with a greasy beard, spat into the dirt and sneered. "Town ain't got room for your kind, warrior. You and that woman best leave before you both end up full of holes." The crowd murmured uneasily. Ruth's eyes darted from one face to another. Most of the townsfolk looked frightened, their mouths tight, but no one spoke out. No one dared. There were spectators waiting for blood to spill. Cale didn't flinch. His voice, low and steady, carried across the silence. "You want me gone? Then come and take me." It was the last straw. The greasy bearded man lunged for his revolver. The world exploded. Gunfire cracked like thunder, shattering the silence. Horses screamed in their stalls, a woman shrieked from behind a saloon window, and men dove for cover. Ruth dropped to the dirt, her ears ringing, as Cale's rifle roared to life. The first bullet found its mark, hurling the bearded man backward in a spray of dust. Another gunman fired, missing Cale by inches, the bullet tearing through a water. Barrel and spraying the street with a fountain of water. Cale moved like the desert wind, swift, unpredictable, unstoppable. His long black hair whipped around him as he ducked, rolled, and fired again. Two more gunmen fell, clutching their wounds, their weapons clattering to the ground. The copper armband on his arm flashed with each movement, a streak of fire against his skin, but they weren't alone. From the alleyway, a hidden figure fired, the shot whistling dangerously close to Cale's head. Ruth screamed, her hands trembling as she pressed herself against the ground. She wanted to do something, anything, but fear rooted her in place. Cale spun toward the new threat, his dark eyes burning. With a powerful stride, he closed the distance, slamming the hidden man against a wall, wrenching the gun from his hands. The warrior's raw strength radiated as he struck, the man crumpling in a heap at his feet. By now, only two gunmen remained, their faces pale with terror. They exchanged a quick glance, then bolted for their horses. Hooves pounded against the earth as they fled the town, dust clouds rising in their wake. Silence returned, heavy and strange after the storm of violence. Ruth slowly pushed herself up from the dirt, her hands shaking. Her dress was smeared with mud, and her heart still pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She looked at Cale, standing tall in the street, chest heaving, sweat running down his skin. His rifle hung loosely in his hand, smoke still curling from the barrel. The townsfolk began to emerge, inching from behind barrels and door frames. Their eyes were wide, their mouths open, but none dared speak. Some looked ashamed, others awed. But most kept their distance. Ruth swallowed hard, finding her voice at last. You saved me." Cale's gaze softened when it fell on her, though his expression remained carved in stone. "I said I would protect you," he murmured. "A warrior keeps his word." For a moment, the two of them stood together in the middle of the silent street, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them both. But beneath the fear and the violence, Ruth felt something stirring deep inside, a fragile spark of trust and maybe even hope. And though the gunfight was over, she knew their trials had only just begun. The town had never been so quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Cale stood in the middle of the street, his rifle heavy in his hand, smoke still rising from its barrel. The fallen men lay where they dropped, dust slowly settling around their bodies. The survivors had fled, their horses disappearing in a blur of hooves and dust clouds. Beside him, the young woman Eliza struggled to her feet. Her shawl hung loose around her shoulders, her dress torn and stained from the fight. She looked at Cale as though he were something she couldn't quite understand, a savior, a danger, a man out of legend. Her lips trembled, but no words came out at first. Cale turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable, chest rising and falling like a storm was still moving inside him. "It is finished," he said simply, his voice deep and steady. Eliza swallowed hard. Why would you do this? Risk your life for me?" Cale's gaze shifted to the men who still watched from the windows and doorways. He could feel their fear, their judgment, the same as he'd felt all his life. "Because no one should stand alone against wolves," he said, his tone edged with quiet fire. "Not you. Not anyone." Eliza's knees almost buckled, but she caught herself. Tears welled in her eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. For the first time in years, someone had stood for her. Someone had seen her worth without asking what she could give, or how silent she could be. From the saloon, the sheriff finally stepped out. A heavy man with a white mustache and a badge dulled by years of polishing, he looked at Cale with something between resentment and reluctant respect. "This town don't take kindly to outsiders," he said slowly. "But today, we owe you." Cale didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing at the man. "Oh" meant little in a place where gratitude turned to suspicion overnight. The sheriff cleared his throat and turned to Eliza. "Miss, you'll be safe here now. We'll see to it." But Eliza shook her head, her voice steadier than anyone expected. "Safe?" she said, bitterly. "These people watched while men came to kill me. They did nothing. Only he," she looked at Cale, "only he stood." The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably in the shadows of their doors, shame flickering across their faces. Cale finally moved. He slid the rifle back over his shoulder, his body towering like a shadow carved from stone. "You have a choice," he told her. "Stay here or come with me." Eliza blinked, stunned. "With you?" He gave a single nod. "The world beyond. This town is cruel, but it is wide. Wider than their chains, wider than their lies. You can be more than their servant, more than their burden." For the first time, Eliza felt her heart rise against the weight of years. She thought of all the doors slammed in her face, of being told to keep quiet, to accept less, to bow her head. She looked at the man before her, a warrior carved by fire and loss, yet still standing. She realized then that this choice wasn't just about leaving a town. It was about claiming herself. Her hand shook as she reached for him, but her voice was steady. "I'll come." Cale's eyes softened, though only slightly. He offered his hand, strong and scarred. She took it, feeling a strange warmth rise through her chest as he pulled her gently forward. Together, they began to walk past the saloon, past the sheriff, past the people who could not meet her eyes. The town parted like water. Too afraid to stand in their way as they crossed the edge of the street and into the open desert, the wind picked up again, tugging at her dress, whipping his long black hair around his shoulders. Behind them, the town shrank into silence. Ahead, the horizon stretched wide and endless, painted in gold and crimson by the setting sun. Eliza glanced back once, then turned her face toward the horizon. She no longer belonged to that town or to the men who had tried to break her spirit. She belonged to herself. And for the first time in her 30 years, she walked beside someone who saw her as more than a shadow. Cale's voice rumbled, low beside her as the desert swallowed them up. "The journey will not be easy." Eliza smiled faintly, though her eyes burned with fierce light. Neither was surviving here. And with that, the warrior and the woman disappeared into the wilderness. Two souls bound not by chains or bargains, but by choice leaving behind the dust of the past and stepping into the promise of something freer, something greater, something wholly their own.